Okay, so let's get into some basic concepts and terminology. Again, this is all the foundation for making a really strong frame. So let's talk about hierarchy. Hierarchy is simply just what you want the viewer to see first, second, third, and so on and so forth. This is really important so that if there's an element in the frame or the story that you're trying to convey, you really need to think about hierarchy. You need to be able to focus the viewer's eye on the thing that you want them to respond to or focus on the most. So a little example here, and some of you guys might be familiar if you've been following my other videos already. This is an example. This is just a lineup of knights and a king. The thing is, they're all the same exact size, they're all the same exact value, and there's just no hierarchy here. We can't tell them apart. They just look like generic knights standing in a row. By adjusting the contrast a little bit, the size and the hierarchy, these are using the same elements, but now I've controlled the eye here, starting with the king in the front who's leading the charge, his right-hand men right behind him, and then the rest of his army way in the distance. So you can see here, just by adjusting some of the values, the size, the contrast, we're able to create a very clear hierarchy, visual hierarchy that unfolds in the viewer's eye. So they see the first layer, which is the king, the people right behind him, and then so on and so forth. So as you guys are making your frames, make sure you prioritize what you want viewers to see. You think about that, maybe even take a note of that thing, and use that as your little checklist as you're evaluating your own frames. Next, we're going to get into framing, lenses, and perspective. And this is where the photography skills come into place, and just understanding how to frame up a scene and how that affects how the viewer feels about it and what you're trying to convey. So I've prepared a couple of examples here of using the same scene. So I have the scene of runners. I just composed this in 3D real quick, and I wanted to show the differences. So right now it's these generic runners, they're in a line and they have just started their race. It's a profile shot, meaning it's from the side. It's knee height, the camera's about knee height, and it's slightly angled up a few degrees. I'm using a 35mm lens, and this is a pretty generic vanilla shot. It's a good establishing shot just to get the lay of the land of what's going on. So taking the same scene, same exact moment, and changing the lens and angle, it drastically changes how we perceive what's going on in the scene. So right now I changed to a 50mm lens. I focused on one of the runners, which now feels like this hero. You know, it feels like it's all about his emotion, his grit, and his determination for this race, where because the other people behind him are smaller in frame, they're out of focus, it feels like they're less important. They're secondary characters, right? So I really want to control the viewer's eye here on this hero. Next, again, same exact scene. I moved the camera all the way down to the floor and I angled it up a little bit. I went ultra wide, which is an 18mm lens, and I wanted to focus on the detail of the start. So I'm imagining that the gun just went off, people are taking off on the race, and it's all about this close-up of how fast these runners' legs start metabolizing and moving, you know, like how soon can they get on action. And it's about this shallow depth of field and the details of their feet and legs taking off. Again, it makes it all about this detail rather than about any specific character in the race. Then one more time, adjusting the camera. Now it's this wide overhead shot with a really long lens. This is a 100mm lens that's pointing straight down at them over the track. As you can see, again, it's all about this shot where it's about all the runners as a whole, who's in the lead, and what's the pace of everybody. Again, just taking all of this same scene and then recomposing the camera, framing the shot very, very differently in different ways, it changed drastically what we're focusing on and how we're feeling in the shots. Does that make sense to you guys, Molly and Erica? Can you guys see the difference between how lenses and framing and angles changed?
Oh yeah, there was a big difference. It's just a normal established thing. You see all the people there, and then close up, you get more of a feeling because there's someone in front of you, and it's more intense.
Right.
Because it's right in your face, and you're like, oh, what's going to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Just being able to see all the micro expressions on somebody's face, or maybe like the grip on their hand, or, you know, like the tenseness of the muscle on their calf. You know, like all those things are really important if you're trying to convey a certain intensity or a certain feeling, versus the wide establishing shots is just trying to bring you into the space.
Okay, that was really cool, by the way. I thought you moved all the guys, like your talent. You moved them around, but
it's the same 3D scene, and I just I floated the camera around.
It's amazing what you can do by just changing a camera angle and the lens, and not changing the actual people or things in the scene.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So those are all things I want you guys at home, those of you guys who are putting together style frames for yourself, consider these things, right? If you're looking at your shot, it looks a little boring, or it doesn't have the focus that you want it to, move the camera around, recompose the screen and frame it up differently, and think about the mood and emotion that you're trying to convey in your sequence.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what about if you're doing a 2D thing? So in 3D, it's easier to move the camera around, but what if it's 2D and you don't know, like you said, we're in the same boat about drawing.
Right.
So how do you depict that if you can't easily move the camera or draw it?
Right. And that all becomes with scale, perspective. If you understand those things, then we'll be able to compose even a 2D shot, which I'll show some examples for, just so that you get the depth and the sense of how a camera lens can affect that. Because even in a 2D sense, I'm still thinking about what lens is on here, how wide, how close. Because all of those things, you're still framing a shot.
Right.
Right? Whether that's in a grounded world, or if it's something that's just more graphic, right? Like those concepts still come into play.
Right.
That's a really good question, and I'm sure some people are asking. So thanks. So yeah, just to recap for the camera, which we already did, just adjusting the camera can dramatically change the angle or focus of any given moment. So let's move on to the next idea, which is lines. Lines, whether they're physical or implied, they dictate how the viewer's eye moves in the scene. So if there's a lot of lines in the scene, it kind of determines the rhythm and where my eye as a viewer is moving throughout the scene. So they're very, very important, along with all the camera stuff we were talking about before. This is very important to lead the eye to where you want them to focus. So here's an example of a frame that we had created. Again, this was painted in 2D, so you could see the difference here, Erica, but it still has that depth, right? You know, it's a wide shot, you're getting a focus on this middle thing. But just to break down this frame so you guys can see it, this is what I'm talking about. There's perspective lines that are in here that are receding all the way to the back horizon. And then there's these physical lines in the stadium, you know, the angles at the top edge. Like all of those things are angled conveniently to be pointing at our hero truck here in the middle. It's a one-point perspective, yeah. It doesn't always have to be that way, but I just want you guys to break this down and look at it and see, you know, from the original, here's, you know, your eye is just magnetized to the center for whatever reason. This is the skeleton underneath. This is why your eye is going here to the center.
Okay.
And we have another frame here. So again, this one doesn't really have a super strong perspective lines that are visible, but I want to show you guys how, again, this is more of an invisible line or implied line. If we're breaking this down, eye lines of characters are huge. So if you see a character in a scene and they're looking at something, or if you see the angle of an object, like let's say this person's gun, it's pointing at something very, very specific so that we could guide the eye. So if we go back to the original frame, you can kind of see we're leading in with this foreground character on the left side, then we bounce over to the right side and you see the enemy shooting at him, and then we get to the rest of the details of the explosion in the background. And the reason why we do that is because of all of these implied lines that are in the scene. So again, the angle of his gun, the eye lines of the characters, and also these extra graphic elements that are in here, this like little paint swatch at the top right.
Matt, I had a question.
Yeah, what's up, Aaron?
So what's the difference between the red lines and the white lines?
The white lines here were just physical lines, and then the red lines are implied lines. So it's like the eye line is the red line, and then like where that guy is shooting on the right side, that red line there is another implied line.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense to both of you guys here?
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be physical, like actual lines.
Yeah.
It would just be, like you said, implied.
Implied.
Like that's just how your eye follows.
Right, and you do that because if you see somebody looking at something, everybody tends to look in that direction too. It's just a human nature. I don't know why it is. It's like, why is this person looking up in the sky? Let's all look up. It's this kind of the same thing. We have this gut reaction that's built in us. It's like, oh shoot, what are they looking out for?
That's
so
how people trip you up too. It's like they just look over like, haha, made you look.
Exactly, it's the same thing. But we don't want to trick people. We want to focus their eyes here, right? Like we want to make sure that they're looking at the right thing. And these eye lines are very, very important. So consider that if you have characters in there, or if you have objects with really sharp angles, like what are they pointing at? If it comes to a point, what is it angled at? And is it to the thing that you want them to focus on?
So that white line there on the top?
Yeah.
Like, did you guys draw in that like, could you talk more about that? Why did you need a line there? And
yeah, I mean, as you can see, there's this style to this frame where it feels a little bit of like a grungy comic, right? It's kind of like almost like a very hand-done, loose comic book that's painted in. So with that, in that aesthetic, we could use things like loose brush strokes. So this was just a little texture that one of my designers had decided to put in. Maybe it was just like a little flourish or accent to the frame, but it actually served the purpose, which was leading your eye in. You have all this negative space. There's this contrast on the top right between the black stroke and the white background, and that's pushing your eye over to the left side.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
so before, without that black kind of guideline mark stroke thing, it just was kind of too empty up there, and it's like my eye wandered over there. And
Exactly. It was negative space that wasn't being utilized. So this was just a quick little accent that we added to help contain the frame and contain the eye. Because one thing that you can do is, like, if there's either too much negative space or unutilized space, I should say, if there's unutilized space there, the viewer's eye is going to go off the screen.